I have my technical advisor very as at arm's length.
Well, now you tell me that you should.
Well, I've done Zoom, but I've never done Zoom and Facebook. I don't even really
All right.
know how that works, but I guess we're about to find out.
It's a brave new world, as we say.
I
And
know,
I
and I'm
think
the
we are
coward.
on. So I'm going to go ahead and get us rolling, I think, here. So welcome to everyone on this fine afternoon in Nebraska. I'm Chris Summerick. I'm Executive Director at Humanities Nebraska, and you have found yourself this way for Humanities at Home, some live programming we've been doing over social media these last few weeks. And just like I've said previously, we really miss seeing people in person at all the different programs and events and activities that we usually are involved in all over the state. And those will return at some point before too long, hopefully. But meanwhile, we're just finding other ways to stay connected, because the humanities are all about staying connected and exploring together what it means to be human. And we've got a really excellent example of that in store for you right now. I think I'd also just take a moment to say, since last time we did this, we've had a whole bunch of young people graduating from high school and graduating from college and finishing up their school years in kind of an unusual fashion. And all of us old fogies out there are cheering you guys on, and just, congratulations to those of you who just graduated from either high school or college, or whether you're just going on to the next grade. It's strange times indeed, but you will always remember that. And, we're here for you too. And I hope you have a great summer. And to you parents who have been helping out with schoolwork at home, congratulations to you as well. Okay, so anyway, Humanities Nebraska, statewide nonprofit organization. We're funded through a combination of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Nebraska Cultural Endowment, the Nebraska Legislature, and private donations from wonderful people all over this state. And we really appreciate all of you. And there's a lot of great needs out there. Today happens to be Omaha Gives Day, so there's a lot of nonprofits in the Omaha area that hopefully are receiving important support right now. And there's been other Give Days all over the state. Humanities Nebraska participates in Give to Lincoln Day, which is next week on Thursday, May 28th. But it's also open right now. So if you choose to support Humanities Nebraska that way, we appreciate it. And just all of you, no matter what you're doing out there for the community, you're greatly appreciated. So this is Humanities at Home, as I said, and one of the things we've been doing is we are encouraging comments from the audience through the course of the hour we spend together, a little bit less. And so you can comment on Facebook, and maybe if you tell us where you're from, since this is Humanities at Home. I'm here in Lincoln, Nebraska, and that's home for me, sitting in my living room, as many of you might be as well. So just share where you're from, and you will, we look forward to your questions. And now I'm going to introduce you here to our amazing speaker, Joe Starita. And I have to say that as we've been kind of all navigating these last couple months, I've been thinking about people and times in history where Americans or anyone have really gone through difficult challenges. And, one of the most remarkable stories, or two remarkable stories that have taken place here in Nebraska that have really inspired me, are the story of Chief Standing Bear and Dr. Susan LaFlesche. And coincidentally, both of those stories are incredibly well told by Joe Starita. And Joe is in our Speakers Bureau, and he's a professor at the College of Journalism and Mass Communications at UNL. He wears many hats, and I'll just read you a few of those hats here. He is, like I said, a professor. He was a working journalist for many years as an investigative reporter at the Miami Herald. He was a Pulitzer finalist for investigative reporting. He was the author of The Dull Knives of Pine Ridge, and then I Am a Man, which is the story of Chief Standing Bear, and The Warrior of the People, the story of Dr. Susan LaFlesche. Last year, Joe was the winner of Humanities Nebraska's SOAR Award in the Humanities. It's our big annual humanities award that is given to somebody who has really helped share stories about building public appreciation for the humanities in Nebraska. And Joe was the winner of that. He was nominated by Molly O'Halloran in North Platte. Happy birthday to Molly. Today happens to be Molly's birthday, I saw. So Joe might have something to say about that too. But she nominated him, and because he had touched the lives of so many people, his students, countless Nebraskans all across the state, by bringing these important stories to life through our Speakers Bureau and through other shapes and forms, people like Chief Standing Bear and Dr. Susan LaFlesche. And I believe Molly said in that nomination, she referred to Joe as the ultimate storyteller, who inspires our thinking in a way that calls each of us to seek the truth in our own lives. And I thought that was very well stated. So Joe, thank you for being with us tonight. And I'd like to kind of just maybe set the stage for this a little bit by thinking about these challenging times. Some words that you hear kind of thrown around are the resilience of Nebraskans, and it's remarkable to think of the strength and resilience in difficult circumstances displayed by people like Chief Standing Bear and Dr. Susan LaFlesche. So you and I talked a little bit about weaving those stories together here this evening. And just for the sake of, especially for people who aren't as familiar with those stories, I wonder if you could just start off by giving us a brief snapshot of Chief Standing Bear and Dr. Susan LaFlesche.
Sure. First, I'd like to just with an opening remark here, I think a lot of authors, I say this frequently in my book talks, are not nearly as grateful as they should be for these kind of opportunities, and I'm not one of those people. So I want to say to you and the listeners that I'm very thankful for this opportunity, and I'm very thankful and appreciative of everything that Nebraska Humanities does to keep raising the cultural literacy bar in this state. And these are two exceptional shareholders of that proposition in the form of Chief Standing Bear and Susan LaFlesche. And I am continually so proud that these are two people on other sides of the gender highway who sprang from the soil of Nebraska and went on in their own way to overcome one obstacle after another. And in the end, they both triumphed in a way that had never been done before, that had never been done before in the history of Nebraska, had never been done before in the history of the United States. So we should be incredibly grateful as Nebraskans and as Americans that we have these double helix strands of Nebraska cultural DNA that we can hug and read about and call our own and visit the places where they grew up and where they made history. And for Standing Bear, in many ways, that began in north central Oklahoma on Christmas week of 1878, when he and his 700 Ponca, a very peaceful, small tribe that had lived for several hundred years in their beloved homeland in the northeast corner of Nebraska. And for those of you who have not been to the Niobrara River in that area of Nebraska, really try and make it, because you can understand the homesickness that was sweeping over the 700 Ponca people as they were forcibly marched from their beloved homeland to all the way through Nebraska, all the way through Kansas, and just kind of deposited and dropped on the soil of Oklahoma without any provisions, without any housing, without any medicine, without anything. So 1/3 of the tribe died in the first year they were in Oklahoma. From July of 1877 to July of 1878, 1/3 of these 750 Ponca, sometimes an entire family, would die in a week. And on Christmas week of 1878, this middle-aged chief of this very peaceful tribe that had taken it upon themselves as a point of pride that they had never harmed a white person. But on Christmas week of 1878, Chief Standing Bear's only son, a 16-year-old boy by the name of Bear Shield, lay curled up in a fetal position on the bottom of a dank army canvas tent, dying of malaria. And before his eyes closed in death, he begged his father, the chief, to take his body back and repatriate his remains in the beloved soil of their homeland along the Niobrara River. And so about 1 o'clock in the afternoon of January 2nd, 1879, Chief Standing Bear wrapped the body of Bear Shield, a 16-year-old boy, in his finest clothes, wrapped it in a buffalo robe, gently put him in the back of a rickety buckboard wagon, and he and 29 other Ponca, including 11 children, began walking north into the teeth of a Canadian blizzard. And that day came in at 19 below zero. These 30 Ponca started heading north into the wind with virtually no winter clothing, no food, and no money. In January of 1879, the government of the United States had entered into 371 treaties with the Native American people. And in January of 1879, the government had broken all 371 of those treaties. But this middle-aged chief who had made this deathbed commitment to his son was not going to break his promise. So they kept going 1 week at a time, 1 month at a time. They would take the young children and the old people and they would tunnel into haystacks at night and put them inside to keep them from freezing to death. The warriors would rummage for field corn during the day, boil it over an open fire, and that's how they would survive until 3 months later, they finally got in early March to the home of their relatives, the Omaha Indian people, on their Omaha reservation in northeast Nebraska. And one of the very first things they did, these starving, desperately ill people, one of the very first things they did was they went to the home of the chief of the Omaha tribe. The chief of the Omaha tribe in March of 1879 was Joseph LaFlesche, the last recognized chief of the Omaha. And I would sometimes I still do, lay awake at night, or when I'm riding a bike, or when I'm out for a walk, when my mind can just be let out on a kite string and I can just kind of like zoom around thinking about what was that like? What was that like in March of 1879 when this middle-aged chief walked into the home of Joseph LaFlesche, and also inside that home in March of 1879 was a 13-year-old girl, the youngest of his 4 daughters. So in one corner, I imagine this ruggedly handsome, courageous chief who had walked into a blizzard more than 500 miles and now was within 2 days from their sacred burial grounds in the White Chalk Bluffs along the Missouri to fulfill his promise. And he's telling all of this to his good friend, Joseph LaFlesche. And in the corner of the room is this little 13-year-old girl who's listening to everything, not knowing that 10 weeks later, this chief of the Ponca people would sue the government of the United States, the entire federal government of the United States. He would sue in federal court for his freedom. And 10 weeks later, unlike Dred Scott 22 years earlier, Standing Bear successfully sued the government of the United States. And the only federal judge in Nebraska at the time, Elmer Dundee, is the one who wrote on May 12th, 1879, a long, lengthy legal opinion that for the first time in the 103-year history of the United States declared that an Indian person from that point forward would have to be regarded as a person within the meaning of the law, entitled to the same constitutional privileges as the more fortunate white race. And people speculate, this is a judge who was an outdoorsman, a frontiersman, loved to go grizzly bear hunting, had never written anything favorable to Native Americans. And all of a sudden, he is overturning the government of the United States, awarding Standing Bear his freedom. And why? Why did that happen? And I would argue, and I would explain, and I would answer that question by saying that this was such a human exchange between a grizzled frontier judge and this middle-aged chief who had just walked 500 miles. And he did it for the love of his son. And Judge Dundee saw in Standing Bear, he saw himself, because he too loved his son beyond all rational boundaries. And he understood the humanity that was being exchanged when Standing Bear was in his courtroom and was telling him about this journey and why he was doing it. And I can't think of another explanation. But when you flash back to that first meeting inside Chief Joseph LaFleche's house, and you see that 10 weeks later, Standing Bear would be making civil rights history in the United States, the first Native American ever to walk into federal court and successfully sue the government of the United States and come out as having the legal privilege of being a person within American law for the first time in the history of the country. That happened 10 weeks later, and 10 years later, this little 13-year-old girl would walk across a room in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to accept her medical degree, not only as a graduate, but as the valedictorian of her class. An Omaha Indian woman who had been in that same room with Standing Bear in March of 1879 was now the first American Indian doctor awarded a medical degree in the history of the United States. An amazing coincidence, an amazing overlap, an amazing journey. And when you think of all the things that Susan LaFleche had to overcome, when you think of the racial prejudice that was against her, when you think of the gender prejudice that was against her, when you look at the Victorian era, the last quarter of the 19th century, and you see where the bar was set for American women, white women, an inch off the ground, you can imagine where it was set for an American Indian woman. And yet, week after week, month after month, year after year, this remarkable youngest daughter of Chief Joseph LaFleche, who spoke 5 languages fluently, who had a medical degree, who graduated as a valedictorian of her class, coming from this remote rural reservation in an isolated part of the Great Plains, who could quote Shakespeare at length, but she couldn't vote. And she wasn't even considered a citizen in her own country. So even though she walked across the stage on March 14th, 1889 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to become the first Native American doctor in the history of the United States, it would be another 31 years before this incredibly educated doctor could vote in her own country. And it would be 35 years before a woman who had a medical degree, quoted Shakespeare, spoke 5 languages, could be considered a citizen in her own country. So for us to have this double strand of cultural DNA this rich, that sprang from the soil of the northeast corner of Nebraska is just, I think, just a great treasure. And I'm really, as almost always very, very happy to be able to celebrate the heroics and the heroism of these 2 individuals.
I have so many questions come to mind, but I want to make sure before I ask anything, just that people know that you can please comment with your questions on Facebook. And Erica Hamilton, our Director of Literary Programs, is watching for your questions and will be interjecting those at whatever point they're there. Joe, thanks for that great overview. And on so many levels, I mean, it's an amazing story. And when I first read I Am a Man, what struck me was the human story, and you talked about that. But for example, I mean, I have a 16-year-old son right now. So I put myself in those shoes and think about what would I do, for my son. And so that the love of that story and the strength of that man and following through with his son's wishes and everything. And you also halfway already probably answered this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So I went to Washington, D.C. in the beginning of March, which seems like a lifetime ago. And I ducked into Statuary Hall, and I got to go see the new statue in Statuary Hall representing Nebraska of Chief Standing Bear. And I just stood there. And I mean, there's a similar one out at the College of Journalism. There's a similar one on the Ponca Lander, I believe. And you can talk more about that. But just standing there, looking at that statue representing Nebraska and feeling that sense of pride and gratefulness that that's there now. But why do you think Standing Bear was appropriate for representing Nebraska in Statuary Hall? And do you think that, do you see more opportunity now to tell that story nationally as well because of that?
Yeah. The first question, let's talk about Americans. Let's talk about the crazy quilt of all these different colors that convey what America is really about, what America's always been about. If you were to compile a checklist of everything that we as Americans, regardless of where our heritage is, where we came from, all of our ethnic background, if you pooled all of that and you just created a checklist of all of the things that we value as Americans: courage, honesty, perseverance, heroism, love of country, love of family. The list goes on and on. I don't care how long a list you compile. These two people check every single box. Yeah. Imagine, and I can't, even though I try all the time, imagine how much you would have to love your son. How much you would have to love your son to defy a government order not to leave the reservation, and then to walk 500 miles in the dead of winter with virtually no food, no winter clothing, and no money to fulfill that promise you had made to that dying 16-year-old boy, that you would take his remains and put them in one of the Ponca's 7 sacred burial sites along the Niobrara River, along the White Chalk Bluffs, near where the Niobrara empties into the Missouri. I mean, at any level of dissection, courage, integrity, honesty, perseverance, love of country, love of family, just that journey alone. I mean, who does this? Who does this? Who can do this? You walk? I mean, I drove that and I was exhausted by the time I got out of the car. It was an exhausting drive in an air-conditioned car. So I just think if you just imagine how much you would have to love your people, love your culture, love your family, love your son, to do that, knowing that you could be arrested, knowing that you could spend the rest of your life in a stockade, but still your love for your son and your culture and your country and your homeland was enough that it overcame every other consideration.
Well, it strikes me that everything you just said also applies to Dr. Susan LaFlesche, a love of her people.
Absolutely.
And I know I probably interrupted the second part of your answer, but that's another thing that really struck me in her story, is the incredible sacrifice and love of people to go back with that degree and going back to the reservation and dedicating her life to taking care of her people.
Susan was cut from exactly the same cloth of what I'm describing. He checks every box. And here is a woman who had a much different experience because she was educated on the East Coast. First, she was educated in Elizabeth, New Jersey at the Elizabeth Institute for Young Ladies when she was 14 years old. Then she went to Hampton in Virginia, where she graduated number 2 in her class. And she began accumulating all of these powerful white women who saw something special in her and wanted her to succeed. And by the time she was a 3rd-year medical student in Philadelphia, she had this fan club of extraordinarily powerful women. And they begged her upon graduation, Susan, for the love of God, stay here. Stay on the East Coast. You can live in a Victorian home with gingerbread trim. You can have servants. You can go to poetry readings every Sunday. You can go to art museums. You can go to concertos, all of which she had loved doing during her 3 years at medical school. Susan never listened to any of that. As soon as she could get the next train back to Omaha, she was on that train because her sole intent to spend 3 grueling years in medical school was to get that medical degree, get back to the Omaha reservation as fast as she could, and spend the rest of her life taking care of the people that she loved beyond all rational boundaries. And what she did, what she put herself through, you can make an overwhelmingly compelling case that this is a woman who literally worked herself to death, getting up at 4:30. And I don't have to guess at any of this because I have all of her diaries. I have all of her journals. And she was a meticulous diarist and a meticulous journal keeper. So we know that she would spend these 18, 20-hour days riding across this frozen terrain in 20 below weather, trying to find that 14-year-old girl curled up in a corner of this one-room log cabin, dying of tuberculosis. And she did this year after year, winter after winter. And again, to imagine how much you would have to love your people to endure the physical hardships and the emotional hardships that she did. Again, it's something that we should celebrate these people, because they are tremendous role models for all of us, particularly on the reservation.
I was struck, just refreshing myself on some of her book, about her work during times of disease outbreaks on the reservation, or also battling alcoholism, amongst her people. But just her efforts for sanitation, better sanitation and things like that, and just the parallels, obviously, and thinking about all the people working in the medical profession right now, taking care of sick people at a time when they're and being at risk themselves. But then extrapolating that to the conditions that she was doing, and that is just remarkable.
Yeah, everything you just said, if you blend it together, that creates the title of the book, A Warrior of the People. I mean, she was one-stop shopping. She did everything. She tended to 1,244 patients scattered across a reservation the size of Delaware in the dead of winter, going across these rolling hills covered in 2 feet of snow, 20 below zero, tending to these people. She taught Sunday school. She delivered sermons. She was a devout Christian and a devout believer in Omaha cultural tradition and the Omaha religion. She entertained pianists from the East Coast. She brought cultural and historians from the University of Nebraska to her home. She had poetry readings. She started the first library for young children on the Omaha reservation. She delivered babies off the reservation to a whole generation of white farm wives. She, on and on and on and on. She was just amazing. And again, you have to think, what could be more human than this, and what could be more reflective of just how courageous she was. Susan believed, she passionately believed that the purpose of life was not to try and avoid pain and suffering, because that was impossible. The purpose of life was to find a purpose and then spend the rest of your life fulfilling that purpose. And she did that to her last breath on the evening of September 18th, 1915, when she died at the age of 50, which was very young.
Oh, yeah, well said. In a minute, I'm going to ask you to read an excerpt from from I Am a Man and from A Warrior of the People. But I'm going to ask Erica to chime in here, because I believe she has a couple questions from people watching, and we do have a big crowd watching, Joe. So,
well, and they had better be asking questions, because what I usually say at the beginning of my talk is I am going to strike a legal oral contract, which is I am going to speak for 45 minutes or so, or maybe less, and then you are going to ask the best questions that I have ever been asked. And I know there are lawyers in the crowd, and they can enforce that oral contract. So I'm well on the way to delivering my end of the bargain. So let's get with it, people.
All right, Erica.
Okay, the first question comes from Natalie Hahn. She says, "Thank you for this overwhelming and moving presentation, but please update us on the situation of the Omaha and Ponca peoples now, and the reservations, and how far have we come?"
Thank you for that question, Natalie. The Omaha Reservation is struggling right now. It's struggling with some pretty severe emotional health, mental health issues. They have endured a very rough spring in which there were many suicides on the Omaha Reservation, many of them among young people. It's always the usual suspects. Nebraska, as we know, is a state comprised of 93 counties. The Omaha Reservation is in the middle of Thurston County, which is the poorest county in Nebraska, the poorest of the 93 counties. It's isolated, it's remote. There is spotty internet service, there is spotty cell phone service. So this isolation, this remoteness creates a lot of problems. Poverty creates a lot of problems. Historical trauma creates a lot of problems. And there is a great deal of effort among a whole bandwidth of people on the reservation who are trying to help and off the reservation. It might be noted that we were told by the superintendent of the Omaha Public School that there was a particular acute shortage of diapers and baby wipes. For the young mothers and their babies, virtually had no diapers and no baby wipes. And so we started a very simple fundraising drive asking a wide circle of people to donate $50. And within a week, or a little over a week, we had raised more than $6,000 from this group of people that was then used to buy baby wipes and diapers, all of which were delivered. And they sent us photographs showing how happy the mothers were and their babies to get all of this converted into things they desperately needed. So, you know, it's a tough situation, but these are survivors. These are people who are really doing really a lot of really good things, but the remoteness and the isolation and now the virus within the last couple of weeks has also arrived at the reservation. And of course, that poses a whole new layer of problems. So there's lots that can be done. Look, I'm all for Bill Gates and Oprah Winfrey building all kinds of hospitals and roads and libraries in Africa. But if they took 1% of that money and addressed some of the issues that need to be addressed in the middle of their own country, that wouldn't be a bad thing either. That wouldn't be a bad thing. Hospitals, schools, internet, laptops, all of that are desperately needed on the Omaha Reservation, on the Pine Ridge Reservation, on the Santee Reservation. Take your pick. So it's not throwing good money after bad anything. There are lots of really engaged people who put this money to good use, and it's people like Susan and Chief Standing Bear that are emerging as terrific heroes for the young people. And that's the biggest thing they need is hope. They need hope in a place where you often have to look very hard for hope and for role models.
Thanks, Joe. And it looks like the questions are now piling in. And Erica, I don't know if you want to, I see you've got one about how Joe researches, or you just take your pick on your questions that have come in.
Well, this one is from Carol Rimp. She says, Native Americans are leery of being researched. How are you able to get such intimate access to the information needed to write these stories?
Carol, that's a really great question. And here's the answer. First of all, I had spent 15 years as an investigative reporter before I started writing books on Native Americans. If you spend 15 years as an investigative reporter, 11 of those years in Miami, 4 of those years in New York, 15 years of reporting in Miami and New York, you get a pretty strong sense of how to read people and what you need to do to gain their trust. And I knew a good deal about Native Americans before I ever started researching these books, but I knew that getting their buy-in was critical. And if I didn't get their buy-in, then it would just be another surface story that didn't, it would be a Platte River story, a mile wide and an inch deep. And I like to try and do the opposite, which is an inch wide and a mile deep. You can't go a mile deep in these stories if the people don't believe who you are. And it took a lot of work and it took a lot of time. But it can be done, and it was done, where if you, look, you start knocking on a door of Guy Dullknife in the middle of the Pine Ridge Reservation, which I did in August of 1992, and you're a strange white man asking a lot of questions, you can expect the door to be slammed. I get that. I understood that. But over time, I never violated. If I said I was going to be there at 2 o'clock and I was going to bring sandwiches, I was there at 1:55 with sandwiches. I never did anything that compromised what I said I was going to do. So you just have to be consistent. You have to be able to read people. You have to be able to show them things you had done in the past, and you have to get them involved in the story. I let Guy Dullknife read each chapter that I wrote because I wanted it to be accurate. I never did that as an investigative reporter, not once. But I wanted him to feel that this was his story, and I was simply the vessel through which it was being told. But I was going to tell it right, and I was going to spend as much time as I needed to with them before I was satisfied that I had a mountain of material that I could then shape into a 300-page, very powerful narrative arc, beginning, middle, and end. But I couldn't do that without his help, without his wife's help, without his children's help. And that's what eventually happened. They trusted me. They had no reason not to trust me. When I would let them read the first chapter and they would correct the spelling of Lakota words, Akichita, no, there's an accent here, not there. They would proofread, they would make sure everything was accurate, and they felt by doing that they were a part of the story. So I did that with the Dullknives of Pine Ridge. I did that with I Am a Man, Standing Bear story. I did that with the Warrior of the People. I got the Omaha people and the Ponca people and the Lakota people involved in telling their own story. It just came through me, and that's how you have to do it if you really want to try and avoid the Platte River syndrome.
So Joe, this seems like a perfect point to maybe ask if you could read an excerpt from, you take your pick on which one you want to pull from first, but just for those of us who hadn't read either the book, if there's, I know it's hard to pull something out, but would you like to pick a page or two?
Yeah, let me pick something from Standing Bear since we started with him, and if there's enough time, there's a really pretty powerful page and a half from Susan as well. We were talking about the narrative arc. I mean, every story has a narrative arc, and it peaks. It peaks at some place. The Standing Bear story peaks, chapter 6, The Color of Blood. And it's the chapter that focuses on what happened on the 3rd floor of the federal courthouse on the corner of 15th and Dodge Streets, where the Doubletree Inn is now in Omaha. What happened inside that monolithic Yellowstone 3-story brick building in the early spring of 1879. I was so terrified of screwing up this chapter that I literally found a remote fishing village on the coast of Italy where nobody could find me unless I wanted them to. And I moved to Italy to write this chapter because I knew if I screwed it up, I would mess up the entire narrative arc. And I'll leave it to readers to decide whether or not the Italian fishing village paid off. So this is the courtroom scene, the climactic scene where Standing Bear confronts the government and the judge and tells his story. Before the crowd began to file out, the judge made an announcement. Although the trial now had officially ended and the legal proceedings were finished, one last speaker, he said, had asked permission to address the court. The judge supposed it was the first time in the nation's history such a request had been made, but he had decided to grant it, and he had earlier informed all of the lawyers in the courtroom of his intention to do so. So the crowd settled back down and turned its attention to the front. They all saw him rise slowly from his seat, and they could see the eagle feather in the braided hair wrapped in otter fur, the bold blue shirt trimmed in red cloth, the blue flannel leggings and deerskin moccasins, the red and blue blanket, the Thomas Jefferson medallion, and the necklace of bear claws. When Standing Bear got to the front, He stopped and faced the audience and extended his hand, holding it still for a long time. After a while, he turned to the bench and began to speak in a low voice. His words conveyed to the judge and the large crowd by Bright Eyes, the Omaha Indian poet and older sister of Susan LaFlesche. That hand is not the color of yours, but if I pierce it, I shall feel pain. If you pierce your hand, you also will feel pain. The blood that will flow from mine will be of the same color as yours. I am a man. The same God made us both. Then Standing Bear turned and faced the audience, pausing for a moment, staring in silence out a courtroom window, describing what it was he saw when he looked out that window. I seemed to stand on the bank of a river. My wife and little girl are beside me. In front, the river is wide and impassable. Standing Bear sees there are steep cliffs all around. The water is rapidly rising. In desperation, he scans the cliffs and finally spots a steep, rocky path to safety. I turn to my wife and child with a shout, "We are saved, we are saved." We will return to the swift running water, the Niobrara, that pours down between the green islands. There are the graves of my fathers. So they hurriedly climb the path, getting closer and closer to safety. The water's rushing in behind them. But a man bars the passage. If he says that I cannot pass, then I cannot. The long struggle will have been in vain. My wife and child and I must return and sink beneath the floodwaters. We are weak and faint and sick. I cannot fight. Standing Bear stopped and turned, facing the judge, speaking softly. You are that man. In the crowded courtroom, no one spoke or moved for several moments. After a while, a few women could be heard crying in the back, and some of the people up closer could see that the grizzled frontier judge had temporarily lost his composure, and that the general, too, Brigadier General George Crook, was leaning forward on the table, his hands covering his face. Soon, some people began to clap, and a number of others started cheering. And then the general got up from his chair and went over and shook Standing Bear's hand. And before long, a number of others had done the same. So the bailiffs asked for order. And when it finally grew quiet again, the judge said he would take the case under advisement and issue his decision in a few days. And then he adjourned the court shortly after 10 o'clock on a warm spring evening on the 2nd of May, 1879 in Omaha, Nebraska.
Well, Joe, I think I speak for everyone when I say I think the investment in the fishing village in Italy paid off. Yeah.
Well, you're very kind. You're very kind.
And I know we're getting on here in time and we've got a lot of questions coming in. So I'm going to ask Erica to read another. Thank you for reading that. And Erica, why don't you shoot Joe another question?
Well, this one is about Susan LaFlesche. It comes from Kim Schaefer Crane. She says, I have always been struck by the unfortunate fact that we never heard about Susan LaFlesche in our Nebraska history class in grade school. Such a travesty. Has that changed, or is there a chance this will change for our Nebraska students?
Another great question. It is slowly starting to change. And I think it's going to keep changing as Susan's profile keeps getting elevated more and more. And I think Chris is going to mention this, but there is an upcoming, what I think is, it's already started, but Susan's segment is going to be in about another month. There is a New York production company that is doing a whole series called Unladylike 2020. And they're focusing on 26 incredible, amazing women throughout American history who have kind of lurked below the radar. And they are very determined to change that. And one of the 26 women that they just fell head over heels about in her story, and why isn't she known more, and why isn't she the subject of history books, is Susan LaFlesche. So they are going to air that, I think, in mid-June, and Chris can jump in at some point and help me with that, because I'm not sure if that's right, but it's close. And so There are just all these tributaries that are flowing in that are kind of forming a Susan LaFlesche River that gets deeper and faster every month, it seems. And there are more and more schools. For example, there is a amazing woman in Omaha, Ann Hubbard, who bought it's like 350 copies, hard copies of the book when it first came out, and gave it to every student at Duchesne Academy in Omaha. So they're all reading it. There are lots of other schools that are adopting it. There is a huge effort afoot. Some very powerful people in Omaha and Lincoln who are pooling their architectural skills, their legal skills, their historic skills to renovate and bring back Susan's Hospital in Walt Hill to its original architectural integrity, and to find a way to use the first floor perhaps as a mental health crisis center in honor of Susan LaFlesche. The second floor would be a museum that would showcase her black leather medical kit and a lot of photos. But the first floor, they want to be have a daily usage to promote health on the Omaha Reservation in honor of Susan. So she'll get there. She'll get there because it's just too important a story and too great a story not to come out. And it's just coming out more and more. And I think it's going to snowball because what's not to like?
Joe,
it's really starting to snowball this year because it's the centennial anniversary of the amendment that gave women the right to vote. And there is a powerful federal judge in Omaha, and I hope she might be listening, who has spent a lot of time, effort, and energy on a July conference, a national conference in Omaha that is going to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote. And the guest speaker at this point is going to be Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And Susan will be featured in that event, as will Standing Bearer.
Joe, yeah, and I know there's hopes that some of that will drift over to Lincoln too. If some of the speakers, we had a wonderful a couple of weeks ago for this same segment. We had Diane Bystrom from our Speakers Bureau do a program on women's suffrage in Nebraska, and it was fascinating. And so we have her back. I'll mention that the Unladylike 2020 project that you mentioned, you're right, I believe that's mid-June that the segment on Dr. Susan LaFlesche comes out. That was funded in part with a grant from Humanities Nebraska. We'll be sure and get that word out when that becomes available. They've been rolling those out a couple at a time. You know, when you were just answering that question, it struck me. One time you and I were at an event at the Nyhart Center in Bancroft at the same time, and we were talking about Dr. Susan, and I remember just being floored by the connection to Nyhart, and it's in the book too, when John Nyhart makes an appearance, and it's just remarkable. Again, overlap of these great Nebraskans.
Yeah. It's the magic randomness of the universe at work. They were neighbors. They were neighbors. John Nyhart and Susan LaFlesche lived about probably less than a football field apart in Bancroft, Nebraska. And he was terrified of her. He was terrified of her. This is the poet laureate of Nebraska, was terrified of her verbal command of the English language, which was about her third language. Because he heard her speak all the time. She would go on the street corners in Bancroft railing against the alcoholism that was destroying her people. She would go to any place, any venue, to try and do whatever she could to eliminate and diminish the problem that alcoholism. So John Nyhart, almost without even trying, would just be walking down the street, and there would be Susan on one of her anti-alcohol riffs, and he has written. You can see it. Tim Anderson is his biographer here in Nebraska, and John Nyhart was intimidated by Susan's verbal prowess, her oratorical firepower, and I love that.
That's amazing.
I love that image of him just kind of walking down the street. Oh my God, there she is again. But he loved her and admired her, and they became pretty good friends.
Yeah. Thank you. Erica, I know we have a couple more questions, including our birthday girl, Molly O'Halloran. I see. So
Happy birthday, Molly.
you take your pick, Erica.
Okay, well, since we're talking about Molly, I'll choose her question. If they could cross time, what advice would Dr. Susan and Chief Standing Bear give to Native Americans regarding the COVID-19 pandemic?
It's clear that Susan would be, she would be suggesting very strongly to maintain 6 feet social distancing and to wear a mask, and Standing Bear would enforce it. So you would get, and that's the great thing. That's a great question, of course, Molly. And look, here's one thing that they both would agree on. It's my belief that you really cannot understand America unless you understand Native America. And it's also my belief that there is a lot that Native Americans and Native American culture could have taught us being the dominant majority. And I mean that Standing Bear from the Ponca tribe and Susan Flesche from the Omaha tribe could teach us. And one thing that they overwhelmingly understood and had in common is that they came from we-based societies. We-based societies where the good of the tribe was always paramount to the good of the individual. They understood that. I would argue or suggest that the dominant culture is more of a me-based culture, not a we-based culture. That we celebrate individual freedom before we celebrate what's best for the group. That's just the opposite, complete 180-degree opposite of almost all Native culture. Because in order for stay around for 10,000 years or longer, they've been on this continent, you have to have that kind of mindset. You have to believe that, as all chiefs did, the welfare of the people was their paramount responsibility. There was no higher calling for a chief than the care for the entire tribe, not the individual. And Standing Bear and Susan, in this pandemic, they would have been completely on the side of maintaining what is best for the whole, what is best for the tribe. And Susan and Standing Bear would be one voice in talking about how we have to survive together. If you look at just the names of the Native tribes, the names themselves, Lakota, the literal translation of Lakota is Alliance of Friends, Alliance of Friends. They became the Sioux because the Ojibwe called them Nadiwisu, which in the Ojibwe language means treacherous snakes. And white explorers just chopped off the first part and they started calling them Sioux. So you could either be the Alliance of Friends in your own language or treacherous snakes. So the Lakota prefer Lakota. Choctaw, the Oklahoma word, the state Oklahoma is a Choctaw word that literally means red people. The Navajo call themselves Dine. Dine literally mean the people. So every single tribe you can identify, the collective mentality is what is best for the collective group, what is best for the tribe, the tribal concept, the we-based society. And Standing Bear and Susan LaFlesche came from a we-based society. That's why she passed up the opportunity to live in a Victorian home with gingerbread trim and go to poetry readings and museums in favor of getting in a buggy at 5 a.m. and rolling across 2 feet of snow in the dark, terrified that she might die all alone in this desolate, freezing, dark, cold, without ever having a family, without ever having a husband. And sometimes she would become emotionally paralyzed by this, but she kept going because she knew that 14-year-old girl curled up in a corner dying of tuberculosis needed her. And she kept doing it till the last breath of her life, giving to the greater good of the tribe, as did Standing Bear. And that's what they would do. That's what they would do with the COVID virus. No question about it.
Great answer. Lots of good things to think about there. We're bumping up, getting close to an hour now, so we probably have to let people go soon to dinner and everything. And I'm wondering if you have any final comments you want to make about either Chief Standing Bear or Dr. Susan LaFlesche, or if you prefer to read something, or we can just wrap up.
I would like to read just a couple of pages from Susan that really capture the heartbeat of who she was and the arc of the story in 2 pages.
I think that'd be wonderful.
We have time for that?
Sure, I'm
Okay.
sure no one will complain. Thank you.
And I love this woman. I mean, I'm madly in love with this woman. I'll just be honest. Who wouldn't be?
I agree.
This is the closing couple of pages from the opening chapter of A Warrior of the People. It's late evening, early autumn, and the lands she once crisscrossed in her battered buggy and buffalo robe have long ago given way to rich ripe fields of corn and soybeans unfurling to the horizon. On a slight rise overlooking the verdant fields, a mile south of where the poet John Neihardt lived before he met the Lakota holy man Black Elk, a feathery row of perfect pines stands at attention, sentinels guarding the southern flank, the only sound in the fading light, the song of the meadowlark from a nearby fence post. Inside the Bancroft Cemetery, fanning out across 3 acres, lie the remains of more than 2,200 village elders, founders, bankers, school teachers, farmers, truck drivers, barbers, bartenders, young children, mayors, sheriffs, hardware owners, meat cutters, pesticide salesmen, families of great-grandparents, grandparents, and grandchildren. A visitor can walk down row after row and see their names: Zalke, Barber, Stahl, Hermelbrat, Konarski, Scooch, Gatzmeyer, Basinger. Along the southern edge of the cemetery, toward the stand of pines, near the end of one row, a 4-foot-high, simple granite headstone rises from the earth. Susan LaFlesche Peacott, 1865, 1915. In the language of her grandfather, the French fur trader LaFlesche, her name means the arrow. And between her birth and the waning weeks of the Civil War and her final resting place, the trajectory of her life would encompass a span of experiences and a range of avocations unlike those of any other Indian woman before or since. As a child, born at a time when her people still lived in teepees and earth lodges, alternating between buffalo hunters and corn growers, she could never have known that one day she would deliver babies, suture wounds, cure fevers and colds, treat tuberculosis and influenza, ban the communal drinking cup, insist on screen doors, and build a remote hospital in an isolated corner of the Great Plains without a single public tax dollar. Back then, in the years after the Transcontinental Railroad and before the Little Bighorn, she could never have known that she would start a library for her children, translate legal documents, cook and deliver meals to the hungry and destitute, preside at funerals, deliver sermons, sing in the choir, and embrace the Native American church. That she would go upstream against the current, taking a train to Washington to crusade against the injustice of federal policies that threatened to steal the land from her people, land that they legally owned. She could never have known about what would accomplish on March 14th, 1889, the day she graduated as valedictorian of her medical school class in Philadelphia, becoming the first American Indian doctor in the 113-year history of her country, 31 years before women could vote, 35 years before all Native Americans could become citizens in their own country. As a young girl growing up on the rich soil of the Missouri River floodplain, Susan LaFlesche could never have known that she would come to love her people so much that she would give her life for them, that she would come to love her homeland so much that she could never imagine leaving it. And now, resting peacefully near the perfect pines, on a slight rise above the lush, verdant fields, not far from the song of the meadowlark, she never will. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you for sharing the gift of your dedicated research and your writing and your storytelling with the rest of us, not just in the classroom, but all of us. And we really appreciate your time. And yeah, this conversation is, I think, exemplified the importance of connecting to each other and learning from each other and sharing stories and envisioning how the past can inspire us towards a better future. One thing I just want to close on too is, and speaking of a better future, you've established a scholarship fund in Chief Standing Bear's name. Could you share a little bit about that?
5 years ago, I created a Chief Standing Bear Journey for Justice Scholarship that goes to Nebraska Native American high school graduates. And the timing is good because we just got done last week going through the applications. It's always the highlight, close to one of the highlights of my year. The poster child for how this works is an Omaha Indian young woman by the name of Rosalind Sansusi. She was the valedictorian of her high school class 3 years ago at Walt Hill, and she's now finishing up, ready to start summer school, entering her final year, her 4th year at Clarkson Nursing College in Omaha. And she has been a 3-time recipient of the Chief Standing Bear Journey for Justice Scholarship, which will award her $2,000 annually to help get her through school. She's got a 3.7 grade point average after 3 years. She's got 1 more year left. She wants to become a nurse, and she will become a nurse. And then she wants to take her medical knowledge back to the Omaha Reservation to help her people in honor of Susan LaFlesche.
That's great.
And it doesn't get better than that.
If anybody wants to support that, is it at the Nebraska Community Foundation?
Nebraska Community Foundation is where it's at. Yes, and you can go to the website and have no trouble finding it. And so each year, five students are selected, and they're always from all over, and it's always an amazing process. And I'm so thankful for the kind-hearted people of Nebraska who have given money to give a Rosalind Sansusi the hope and the courage. And as I tell them, I don't care what you do. You can repair diesel mechanics, you can become a doctor, but this scholarship is a bridge to get you from high school to a job that will generate a paycheck, that will allow you to support a family, that will allow your family to become stakeholders in whatever community you're living in. That's the point. That's what Rosalind is doing. That's what we're going to keep doing as long as we're on this side of the grass.
Oh, that's fantastic. And we always enjoy partnering with you on different things, Joe, and just look forward to the time when we're all back together in person. And I'm sure you feel the same way, whether it's a classroom or out in a library giving a talk somewhere.
Yeah.
And we'll get there.
Yeah. We're social people, and we can only, socially distance so long, and we've got to wait for the vaccine. But yeah, I look forward to that day, and I want to congratulate and thank you and all the people who tuned in. This is a special place. I mean, I lived in Miami. I lived in New York. There was no chance of raising my son in either one of those places. This was the right choice. And this is really a place where you can get things done, where people care, and they will spend time, and they will spend money, and they will spend effort and energy to restore a hospital, or to help feed people who have no food, or pay the rent for people who have no rent money, or give a scholarship to people whose family has never had anybody attend college. That's what Nebraska is all about to me.
I agree. Well said. And so yes, thank you to everybody for being a part of what makes Nebraska great, and for being with us tonight for this program. Humanities Nebraska is just going to keep plowing away at finding different ways to reach you with good humanities programming like this. And we'll be looking forward to seeing you soon. I want to thank my colleagues at Humanities Nebraska, Erica Hamilton and Christy Hyatt Carley and Sherilyn Hansen for being part of the team that makes this possible. And we plan to continue doing this. Next Wednesday, we're going to bring back again our Primetime Family Reading Time team to do another children's story time in English and Spanish. And that's also something that we're supporting through our Give to Lincoln Day, if people can donate to that. And otherwise, we just look forward to staying in touch. And I hope you all stay well. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks again.
Thank you, Chris.
All right. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's fun. You're a natural.
I could give this talk.